I've seen what happens when politicians encourage resistance while pretending they're calling for calm. The street always hears the first message louder than the second. I spent years inside the intelligence system watching how authority works when it is respected and how quickly it collapses when leaders decide it is optional. Law enforcement does not function on slogans or sentiment. It functions on legitimacy, clarity of mission, and the understanding that lawful orders will be enforced, not debated in the street. When political leaders undermine that legitimacy, they are not engaging in moral signaling. They are dismantling the architecture that prevents chaos. What we saw recently in Minneapolis is not an isolated tragedy, but a predictable outcome of sustained rhetorical and political sabotage of federal law enforcement operations. In that incident, ICE officers conducting targeted enforcement were confronted by hostile crowds, obstructed in the execution of lawful warrants, and ultimately faced a vehicle attack that resulted in lethal force being used in self-defense. None of this occurred in a vacuum. Intelligence professionals are trained to look at conditions, not emotions. The condition here was clear. Years of public demonization of federal agents, explicit political messaging, encouraging resistance, and local leadership signaling that enforcement would not be supported. That combination is combustible. From an intelligence standpoint, the failure is not tactical but strategic. When elected officials publicly reject federal authority while lacking the constitutional power to do so, they send a signal that laws are negotiable and enforcement is illegitimate. That signal travels fast. It reaches activists, opportunists, and unstable actors who interpret it as permission. In my career, I learned that violence often follows ambiguity, not clarity. When the rules are blurred, individuals test boundaries, and officers are forced into split-second decisions under conditions deliberately made hostile. The strategic consequence is erosion of credibility, not just of law enforcement, but of the state itself. Once enforcement becomes contingent on political approval, intelligence warnings lose force, deterrence collapses, and escalation becomes more likely. The hard lesson here is that leaders who posture against enforcement without offering lawful alternatives are not protecting communities, they are exposing them. Intelligence does not judge intent, it measures outcomes. And the outcome of delegitimizing law enforcement is always the same: disorder first, violence second, and regret last. Would you like me to continue with Section 2, Intelligence Ignored, Signals Reversed? One of the first lessons drilled into me as an intelligence officer was that warning signs rarely arrive as dramatic alarms. They come as patterns, incremental shifts in behavior, rhetoric, and risk tolerance. What happened in Minneapolis followed a pattern that any competent analyst could have flagged months ago. When political leaders publicly accuse law enforcement of causing chaos simply by enforcing federal law, they invert reality. That inversion is not harmless rhetoric. It reverses signals across the entire threat environment. Officers become villains, resistance becomes virtue, and violence is reframed as civic action. From an intelligence perspective, that is a textbook recipe for escalation. The Minneapolis incident did not begin with a gunshot. It began with sustained political messaging that framed federal enforcement as illegitimate and dangerous, while omitting the legal authority under which it operated. Intelligence warnings about rising hostility toward federal officers were not secret. Assaults, threats, and coordinated obstruction of enforcement actions had been documented and publicly acknowledged well before this event. Yet instead of adjusting rhetoric to reduce risk, leaders doubled down, amplifying grievance narratives and dismissing operational realities. This is where intelligence failure becomes political choice. Analysts can warn about increased threat levels, but when leadership refuses to integrate those warnings into decision-making, signals are not just ignored, they are actively reversed. The strategic consequence is predictable. Individuals who might otherwise hesitate interpret political statements as endorsement. Crowds feel emboldened to obstruct, surround, and physically challenge armed officers. In Minneapolis, that environment culminated in a vehicle being used as a weapon against federal agents, forcing a lethal response in self-defense. From an intelligence standpoint, The most dangerous moment is when leadership reacts to such outcomes not by reassessing their role, but by further blaming enforcement itself. That reaction guarantees repetition. I have seen this dynamic before in foreign theaters, where governments undermine their own security forces for political gain. The result was always the same: degraded intelligence flow, rising violence, and eventual loss of control. The hard lesson is that intelligence warnings cannot compensate for leaders who refuse to acknowledge cause and effect. When signals are reversed, when enforcement is treated as provocation and resistance as righteousness, violence stops being an anomaly and starts becoming an expectation. Would you like me to continue with Section 3, Sanctuary Politics and Federal Erosion? Sanctuary policies are often sold as humanitarian gestures, but intelligence work is not about intent, it is about effect. The effect of sanctuary politics, when paired with hostile rhetoric toward federal enforcement, is the steady erosion of federal authority at the operational level. The Constitution does not grant local officials the power to nullify federal law, yet repeated public statements implying exactly that create an illusion of permission. That illusion matters. In my experience, erosion rarely begins with formal defiance, it begins with ambiguity. Local leaders say they will not cooperate, then escalate to saying federal agents should leave, and eventually frame enforcement itself as illegitimate or dangerous. Each step weakens the chain of authority that intelligence and law enforcement rely on to function safely. Minneapolis illustrated this erosion clearly. Federal officers operating under lawful authority found themselves isolated, surrounded, and obstructed, not because the law was unclear, but because political leadership chose confrontation over coordination. From an intelligence standpoint, this creates a fragmented security environment where federal and local actors operate at cross purposes. Information sharing dries up, deconfliction fails. Officers no longer know whether backup will arrive or whether local officials will publicly condemn them after the fact. That uncertainty is lethal. The strategic consequence extends beyond a single incident. Once federal enforcement is portrayed as an occupying force rather than a lawful instrument of the state, every operation becomes a potential flashpoint. Crowds gather faster, resistance hardens sooner. Individuals willing to escalate feel politically shielded. Intelligence assessments consistently show that violence increases where authority is contested rather than affirmed. Sanctuary rhetoric, when untethered from constitutional reality, turns routine enforcement into symbolic confrontation. The hard lesson here is that federal erosion is not abstract. It shows up in response times, in officer safety statistics, and in civilian casualties. Leaders who posture against federal law while enjoying the protection of that same law are engaging in strategic self-sabotage. Intelligence cannot compensate for governance that encourages defiance without bearing responsibility for the outcome. Would you like me to continue with Section 4, Weaponized Narratives and Manufactured Outrage? Narratives are not decorations in a security environment. They are force multipliers. I learned early that whoever controls the story often controls behavior on the ground. In Minneapolis, the narrative was shaped before facts were established, and that timing mattered. Political leaders and media voices framed the presence of federal agents as the source of disorder, not the response to lawbreaking. From an intelligence perspective, that is narrative inversion. It takes the effect and labels it the cause. Once that frame is established, every subsequent detail is interpreted through it. Crowds do not wait for verified information, they respond to cues. When leaders publicly condemn enforcement in real time, they are not calming a situation, they are inflaming it. The Minneapolis incident unfolded in precisely that sequence, with official statements issued before operational facts were known, reinforcing hostility toward agents conducting lawful operations. This is where outrage becomes manufactured. Facts are selectively emphasized or omitted to fit a pre-existing storyline, and complexity is stripped away. Intelligence assessments warn against this because simplified narratives are easier to weaponize. They turn enforcement into provocation and resistance into virtue. The strategic consequence is acceleration. Protest morphs into obstruction, obstruction escalates into violence. When a vehicle is used as a weapon against officers, that is not spontaneous. It is the endpoint of sustained narrative conditioning. I have watched similar dynamics abroad, where governments undermine their own security forces to appease political constituencies only to lose control when violence followed. The hard lesson is that narratives do not absolve responsibility. Leaders who amplify outrage without restraint are shaping the threat environment as surely as any armed actor. Intelligence can track weapons and movements, but it cannot neutralize a story that tells people the law is illegitimate and enforcement deserves resistance. Once that story takes hold, the margin for error collapses, and every encounter carries the risk of irreversible consequences. Would you like me to continue with Section 5, the operational consequences on the ground? When policy rhetoric collides with reality, it is not politicians who absorb the impact, it is officers on the street and civilians caught in the margin. Intelligence assessments consistently show that the most dangerous phase of any enforcement action is the moment of contact, when uncertainty is highest and reaction time is lowest. In Minneapolis, federal officers were conducting targeted operations under lawful authority when they encountered obstruction, crowd convergence, and ultimately a vehicle attack that forced a lethal defensive response. That sequence is not anomalous. It is the operational consequence of sustained political signaling that enforcement will not be supported. From an intelligence standpoint, the risk profile changes dramatically when officers expect interference rather than cooperation. Tactics shift from arrest-focused to survival-focused. Attention that should be on suspects is diverted to crowd control, situational awareness, and threat detection from multiple directions. This increases the probability of escalation and error. The strategic consequence is a feedback loop. Hostile environments require heavier security postures, which then feed narratives of militarization, further inflaming resistance. Minneapolis demonstrated this loop in real time. Large law enforcement deployments became necessary not because of overreach, but because authority had been eroded to the point where order could not be assumed. I have seen this pattern repeatedly in unstable regions overseas. Once enforcement loses local legitimacy, whether deserved or manufactured, every routine operation becomes a flashpoint. Intelligence officers call this an environment of contested control. In such environments, violence is not an outlier. It is a statistical expectation. The hard lesson is that operational outcomes are shaped long before an incident occurs. Leaders who undermine enforcement create conditions where officers must choose between retreat and survival. When survival requires force, the political class often disowns the very officers they placed in danger. Intelligence work teaches accountability through outcomes, not intentions. And the outcome of delegitimizing law enforcement is always measured in injuries, deaths, and a deeper loss of trust that cannot be reversed with statements after the fact. Would you like me to continue with Section VI, historical parallels and institutional decay? Nothing about this moment is unprecedented. Intelligence history is crowded with examples of governments that weakened themselves by undermining their own enforcement institutions for short-term political gain. In the United States, we have seen this dynamic before during periods of federal-state confrontation, from resistance to desegregation orders in the 1,950 seconds to the unrest that followed politicized policing debates decades later. The lesson from those episodes was clear. When lawful authority is openly contested by elected officials, disorder follows until authority is reasserted or collapses entirely. Minneapolis fits squarely into that historical pattern. Federal officers executing lawful mandates were treated as intruders rather than agents of the state, while local political rhetoric encouraged defiance instead of coordination. From an intelligence perspective, this signals institutional decay. Institutions rely on shared assumptions about legitimacy. Once those assumptions fracture, enforcement becomes selective, intelligence sharing becomes unreliable, and command authority weakens. Abroad, I watched governments lose control not because they lacked forces, but because they lacked coherence. Security services were blamed publicly while being relied upon privately, creating paralysis. The same contradiction is visible here. Local leaders denounce federal enforcement while benefiting from the broader security framework that enforcement sustains. The strategic consequence is normalization of resistance. What begins as protest hardens into obstruction, then escalates into violence, all justified by a narrative of moral exception. History shows that reversing this decay requires either decisive reassertion of authority or prolonged instability. There is no middle ground. Intelligence cannot repair institutional legitimacy once leaders themselves have compromised it. The hard lesson is that decay is cumulative. Each incident that goes unresolved, each act of defiance left unchallenged, lowers the threshold for the next escalation. Minneapolis was not the beginning of this process. It was a visible milestone in a longer trajectory of institutional weakening. Would you like me to continue with Section 7, the hard lesson intelligence always learns too late? Intelligence work teaches humility through repetition. The same patterns recur, and the same lessons are ignored until the cost becomes undeniable. The hard lesson here is not about immigration policy or political ideology. It is about authority. When leaders undermine law enforcement publicly, repeatedly, and without regard for operational reality, they are not engaging in dissent. They are dismantling deterrence. Minneapolis was a case study in how quickly that dismantling turns lethal. Federal officers were placed in a hostile environment shaped by political rhetoric that framed their presence as illegitimate. Crowds were emboldened to obstruct and confront, and a vehicle was ultimately used as a weapon, forcing a fatal defensive response. Intelligence professionals call this predictable surprise. Everyone claimed shock after the fact, yet every indicator was visible beforehand. Assaults on officers increased. Threats escalated. Cooperation eroded. Leadership ignored or dismissed these signals because acknowledging them would have required changing the narrative. The strategic consequence is broader than a single death. Once enforcement is politicized, intelligence loses its corrective function. Analysts can warn, but warnings that contradict political messaging are sidelined. Deterrence fails because adversaries, whether criminals or radicalized activists, no longer believe the state will act coherently. The erosion of credibility extends outward. Allies question reliability. Adversaries probe weakness. Domestically, communities are left less safe, not more. The final hard lesson is this: law enforcement legitimacy is not restored through statements issued after violence occurs. It is maintained through consistent support for lawful authority before the first confrontation happens. Intelligence officers learn, often too late, that chaos is not accidental. It is the end game of leaders who treat enforcement as optional and consequences as someone else's problem. When authority is sacrificed for politics, the outcome is never justice, it is disorder, followed by regret that no narrative can undo.